We don't know that. How sustainable are these fiscal policies? We don't know that. What should be the fiscal policy response in poorer countries? This is equally important because the poorer countries, the less developed countries, they don't have that kind of fiscal spending power to be able to engage in the sort of fiscal stimulus packages that we have seen in the developed countries. So there are policy-oriented questions here in terms of effectiveness, in terms of sustainability. So going forward, this to me would be more interesting questions to look at. Overall, there's a lot to learn, as I summarize in that point, about fiscal policy lessons before we settle on a fiscal policy blueprint in the pandemic world. And I think this is what I meant earlier when I said, we haven't yet converged to a set of policies that we know is going to work or has the potential to work. We are still searching for that equilibrium policy making, and this is where I feel that future research can be devoted. From fiscal policy, moving to monetary policy. When we talk about monetary policy, the first thing that comes to our minds is the role of central banks. And one of the things we have noticed in this pandemic phase is that there has been greater central bank activity. And you can see from, if you go to any central bank website, they have lots of information, press releases, policy statements about COVID-19, about recovery, country specific, talking about their own countries in particular. Even developing country central banks, if you go to Reserve Bank of Indonesia, Bank Indonesia, Bank Negara, there is information about COVID-19. Another set of information and another indicator of the intensity of central bank activities is the number of workshops and conferences in which central banks are participating and actually hosting or co-hosting with other institutions. Bank Indonesia is a classic example of central bank where they're engaged in multiple workshops on monetary policy effectiveness. There is 2 workshops that
Slide show, Prof. Yes.
With Bank Indonesia, with Asian Development Bank Institute as well, discussing the effectiveness and the role of central banks. The key questions are, again, this is for future research for people who are interested, is how have markets reacted to these central bank activities? So nobody has actually looked at central bank activities in this case. Because maybe people are not aware of the intensity of central bank activities. How effective these monetary policy signals have been. There have been a lot of signals coming from central banks, and you don't have to go anywhere but to the central bank websites to see the level of policy intensity signals that are coming from the central banks. The question is, how have markets interpreted these signals, and what has been the response of the market? So this is more a behavioral finance, economics type questions that I feel that the future research can concentrate or focus on. So overall, central bank policy making in many countries is leading the policy response in this pandemic. But from a knowledge point of view, we do not yet understand what have been the outcomes of those central bank initiatives and policy intensity, and what has been the effectiveness of those policies. So I feel that future research should actually target this as future research agenda. Other areas, financial position. So this is very important, because if you just forget about the pandemic, if you take the pandemic away, leading up to the pandemic, there were many countries who were actually facing financial stress. The financial situation of many developing countries and emerging markets was not healthy. They had high debt to GDP ratios already, and IMF had actually identified a number of countries from the developing country world that were actually on moving towards an unsustainable path, given that debt to GDP ratio. So that was the situation before the pandemic. What the pandemic has done, it has made the financial positions of these countries even worse because of the slowdown in economic activity. And we understand tourism has come to a standstill. There are a good 50 countries in the world that actually depend on tourism. and the majority of these countries are developing countries. So what the pandemic has done, which people have not been looking at, is it has actually made the financial position of countries weak compared to what it was before the pandemic. So what it means for us as researchers is to identify what is the new growth model now, because it cannot be your classical endogenous growth model of productivity led growth. No, we cannot be talking about productivity growth. Why? Because there's no economic activity, or economic activity has in many countries declined by 20% or more. Unemployment globally has gone up by 20% or more. Tourism sector has lost 80 million jobs out of 300 million jobs. So effectively, what we have been preaching, what we have been using as policy tools, the endogenous or exogenous growth models, where we see R&D and productivity as important. Human capital is important part of the growth model. That is no longer the case. So we have to identify what is the new growth model. And more importantly, for those 50 plus countries where tourism and service, not only tourism, but service sector in general, had been an important part of that economic growth, what are the substitutes to international tourism? Because we know that international tourism is not going to return to the levels that we had experienced before the pandemic. It has to be a different world. We cannot be returning, at least not in the next 10 years. It looks like that way, and hopefully, I'm wrong in saying that, but current indications are that we are very, very unlikely to return to international tourism the way it was. The questions are, what are the substitutes for international tourism for these developing countries? Can remittance, for instance, be a substitute? Because in many of the countries which were dependent on tourism, they were equally dependent on remittances as well. Can remittance be a substitute? I don't think so. So I don't have answers to this, but these are questions for future research. So the overall issue that I see is what is the new policy mix and growth model for the global economy? Higher education sector. So this has been a bigger part of the story in the pandemic world. Particularly higher education has been a source of exports for many countries. And many developed countries as well, which had depended on international students for higher education growth. And we know that with international travel coming to a halt, international students are not able to travel to different countries for university education. So the question is, how do universities adjust to this new student environment that does not allow for international travel? And those working in education economics would be interested in looking at this, that how should the universities now adjust, and what sort of models are there? Or what is the innovation in the model that we can propose to universities? So that's another area, particularly those working in, as I said, education economics. Labor market, people working in labor economics would find this of interest, I hope. Labor market, as I said, and we know, has experienced significant losses of jobs. Unemployment is growing. The recovery is slow. There's large surplus labor now. There's large surplus labor now, and the question becomes, how does the labor market actually absorb them? Because they come up with different skill sets. For example, those people who have been laid off from the tourism industry, given their skill set, how can the labor market in other sectors of the labor market actually adopt them, given the skill sets are different? So what is the role of the state in empowering the labor market to be able to use the skill set that is there? So these are very important questions from a policy point of view. We also know that the pandemic is going to delay firm investment, right? Because the pandemic is still ongoing. It's not like our global financial crisis that it came and in a month it went away. No, it's not like that. The pandemic is very, very persistent. It continues to close down economies globally. So what it means is that the probability of job creation is going to be low. When that is the case, it's not going to generate income for people. So labor market policies and investment incentives will need to be considered in tandem in order to help in the recovery of the labor market. The state, as you can see, the state, our governments have got a bigger role to play from a fiscal policy point of view, trying to reinvigorate the labor market to be able to adjust to the surplus labor. So this is a big challenge, and you know how governments do that, it's unknown because you know this is a crisis of once in a lifetime, and we have been confronted with policy challenges to which we don't have answers. So the overall issue is how will the labor market adjust, and what incentives are needed to resume job creation. So these are big questions for research, I think. Same thing with the banking sector. So if you look at banking sector, there is issues of banking sector stability. What the pandemic has done, it has, because it has reduced incomes, it has reduced business activities. It is going to make debt servicing more difficult. There will be many defaults that we could expect. So the question is the debt servicing sustainable? There will be a lot of non-performing loans as well as businesses close down, as unemployment increases, as the global economy struggles to recover, like tourism. Many of the businesses are going to close down, and what it means is that they will not be able to service their debt. And when that happens, it's going to create banking sector stress, which again means if the banking sector is in stress, it is not going to lend to the private sector and the household. So there will be lack of credit to the private sector and household. And what is the implication then? If there is lack of credit, we know what happens. We cannot grow, right? No finance, no access to finance means we cannot grow. So there's a cycle of slow growth. One is from the pandemic itself, and then the other one is the persistency of the pandemic by reducing economic output, closing businesses, and so forth, leads to default and makes the debt servicing unsustainable, and therefore greater non-performing loans are there. So this is going to, that's why I say it's a cycle, because it's going to delay recovery in a big way. So overall issue is how the banking sector liquidity can be improved to kickstart investments. And I think, again, this is a very much a financial issue in terms of how and the role of central banks here is also very important. How they help the liquidity situation of the banking sector. So this, I think, would be another of those issues that future research can pick up. Identifying the issues with R&D and productivity, I think this is also very important, not in the immediate term though, because as I said, R&D, productivity, these affect economic growth in the long term. What we have been talking about so far is the short-term challenges and short-term solutions. The problem with R&D, we know that R&D is important for economic growth, but with the uncertainty driven by the pandemic, the future prospects of recovery are bleak. So firms are going to cut down on R&D, right? Because simply because their outputs have gone down. So there will be a reduction in R&D anyway. So even assuming that productivity and R&D are still active components of economic growth in this pandemic world, we will still struggle to see increases in R&D. So the issue really is, what is the new role of R&D in the pandemic world, given that we know there is weak demand, productions are declining, productivity is lower, people are working less hours, people are not working at all, businesses are operating at 50% capacity. So the question is, how do we boost productivity? Again, this is a macro issue. It's a state issue to look at policies of how to encourage productivity growth. Again, there's no easy fixes to these questions, and they require innovative thinking. So what effects will a shock to R&D and productivity have on firm performance, corporate debt, and economic growth? And I think this is another area that future research can be devoted to. I think it's important that we also talk about MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, because a lot of progress had been made leading up to the pandemic on the MDGs. Many countries have made significant progress on MDGs. Now, a lot of that progress from health to education to gender equality to mental health to environmental sustainability has been, again, negatively impacted by the pandemic. There have been job losses, which have led to income inequality. So one of the MDGs goals were to reduce income inequality, bring gender balance. A lot of the loss of income, loss of jobs have been felt by females as well. So that is going to increase gender inequality as well. There's greater pressure on healthcare now under the MDGs. Healthcare, health infrastructure as one of the bigger part of the MDG agenda. That's now under pressure as well. A lot of the good work has been evaporated because a lot of resources have been devoted to fighting the pandemic. So that has come at the cost of other aspects of the health system. And the key issue now is reaching the vulnerable groups in a timely manner. Because if we are not able to reach those vulnerable groups, particularly in this pandemic, it's going to make the situation much, much worse in terms of inequality in health, in income, in education, and gender-wise as well. Key issues are mobilizing resources like medical expertise and food and water and vaccines to these different groups. So again, people working in development economics would find this area of research more interesting in terms of strategies to reach these vulnerable groups, identifying what are the alternative sources of income, because we know these are the groups of people who have been severely affected by the pandemic through losses of jobs and lack of health facilities and infrastructure. People working in development economics may find this more relevant. Again, this is an extension of the development economics type thinking, the social crisis, the gender violence. You're looking at the statistics, and I was looking at the other day, there's a very significant increase in gender violence due to lockdowns, people staying together under one roof and creating that kind of social crisis. There's also health issues, mental health issues related to that. There's greater unpaid jobs. Obviously, the informal sector work is increasing or is going to increase. But a lot of this is unpaid jobs, providing care for the sickly. The pandemic has led to a growth in the number of sick people. It's not necessarily the elderly people, but it's across the board. As we can see, things happening in India, before that in Brazil. So there's a wide range of things happening here, and the question is, what are the strategies to mitigate the social crisis? Again, as I said, this may not be of interest to everyone, but those working in development economics may find this to be an active area of research to pursue. Those working in international trade may find this issue about global trade. There has been disturbed supply chains and value chains have been greatly affected by this lockdown of international borders, and we have seen there have been geopolitical tensions that have affected trade flows. There have been bilateral trade wars. There have been trade wars between the US and China. There have been trade wars between Australia and China, and India and China. So there are a lot of these geopolitical tensions and bilateral trade tensions that have come about in this pandemic. And what it does is it's kind of questions, does international trade still hold the key to economic recovery? This is an important question because in the past crises we have had, particularly the financial crises, international trade has been at the forefront of recovery. The same cannot be said about international trade this time with the pandemic. So there's a shift in the role of international trade in the way we have perceived international trade as a solution for recovery in the past. Right? In the pandemic, we are not seeing that. And I think this is an active area of research, is to see what exactly is the role of international trade. And if international trade is not the one to lead the recovery, then what can lead the recovery? What is out there? And that's why I flag this as an important area of research. Climate change continues to be obviously at the top of the agenda for global bodies, UN as well. There has been slowdown in economic activity, which has led to a reduction in CO2 emissions. International travel, as we know, a large component of our CO2 emissions have been coming through international tourism, and travel is a big part of it. Airlines, for example, and that has come to a standstill, and CO2 emissions have gone down, obviously. So the new research question here is, should the carbon emission policies and strategies and schemes change now? Because you may recall, in those working in climate or environment areas would know that before the pandemic, there was very, very big focus on CO2 emissions, the commitment of different, not only countries, but also firms towards cutting down on carbon emissions. So the question now is, we know that this pandemic is going to change the way at least international tourism used to operate, which was a big contributor to CO2 emissions. The question is, should the policies and strategies change now? So those working in the area of environment, energy, climate change may find this to be equally important area of research. Okay, so I think I'm on time now, so I've got a couple of minutes, so that allows me to conclude the talk. So you can see from the popular themes of research that I've identified, financial markets seems to be very, very active because of availability of data. 1/3 of the literature, academic literature, focuses on that. What I've identified for you is some missing links, some areas where greater focus of researchers can be devoted to identify something new that you can do, as opposed to doing the same sort of things that others have done, which will make it difficult for you to get publications in journals. So some of the things I talked about was fiscal policy innovation, looking at how effective fiscal policies have been so far. I also talked about monetary policy signals. The intensity of central bank activities have kind of multiplied in this COVID-19 pandemic phase. There have been a lot of monetary policy signals coming out from central banks, how effective these have been, how sustainable these have been. These are not studied at least at this stage. So there is an attraction to these areas for future research. From a development economics point of view, I think that there is a greater scope to look at a range of issues, from MDGs, social crises, as I highlighted. There can be significant development economics related work there. Academic research on pandemic should be judged by the quality of policy ramifications, I believe, or by its impact on recovery. So this is one of the things that I tried to identify, that in my talk, that there's been a lot of this research has happened from an academic point of view, but there is a lot to learn from a policy point of view before we converge to any blueprint on either it's a fiscal policy blueprint or a monetary policy blueprint. We need to understand the policy responses more. We need to understand the effectiveness of these policies. And of course, we need to understand the sustainability of these policies. So I feel that if future research can be devoted to these kind of policy-oriented, with a strong academic, of course, foundations to it, then academic research can make a difference to the recovery efforts from this pandemic. Okay, so that's what I have to share with you, but I'm sure that you would have other things to ask me or to contribute to the discussion. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Narayan, for the such sessions and presentation from Professor Narayan. As we know, during the pandemic, there are so many issues, perspective from economics sector, and specifically in banking, in R&D, and also the productivity sectors. And by identifying those related issues, as scholars, we wish to be able to create future paths of research from us, what was happening based on what was happening situation, and create the alternative strategies and also the impact for the policy and as well as for the society. Okay, now I will open the Q&A sessions for all of the participants. So as I write on the chat box. You can use raise hand features for direct interaction to Professor Narayan. And also simply you can write your questions in the chat box with format name _school or institution you are coming from _ questions, and I will read your questions. So please, anyone? Okay, there is one participant that has raised his hands. Pak Dedi Marciano, Mr. Dedi Marciano. Please, committee, can you unmute the microphone of Pak Dedi Marciano? Okay, hello, Pak Dedi.
Yes, hello,
okay. Yeah, so please, Pak Dedi.
Okay. Thank you for the sharing. It's very good presentation and enlighten us about the future research of the finance. I would like to ask you questions about the fintechs. How about the impact of the COVID pandemic about to the fintech development in the world and Asia, and also maybe in certain country? Thank you, Mr. Paras.
Okay, no, thank you very much for that question. I think that's a very useful question in light of the fact that UNS FinTech Center is there. I think the way to think about fintech is, at least in this pandemic, there has been a greater role, I think, for fintech in this, because even before the pandemic, there has been at least some substitution of conventional banking service roles that had been taken up by fintech, and that was one of the key issues. Some of those things were taken service delivery wise by fintech, and a lot of, because we have moved towards digitalization, a lot of online shopping, for instance, has been a central part of this pandemic, that we have, even in developing countries where there was no scope for online shopping or apps for online shopping, in small island countries such as the Fiji Islands, where I am from, in this pandemic, there have been an upshot of this apps for shopping purposes. So online shopping, greater digitalization, of course, of this, and the role that the internet has played in this has been an integral part of the livelihood of people, in particularly in the lockdowns. The same thing now in all those countries. If you look at the data, and a lot of the data is not there for us to actually look at this relationship in a robust way. And I think this would be the big challenge even leading up to the pandemic. There was limited data on fintechs to be able to look at or test different hypotheses, and that would continue. Maybe we will get access to more data now in the pandemic than we had in the past. So this there's a lot of unknowns about fintech, but the reason why fintech is not talked about, it's a very obvious one to me, because we've got bigger challenges here. For us to worry about a small component of the financial system, which is fintech. Fintech is really a small component of the financial system, a very important one, not to devalue it in any way, a very important one. But I feel that, given the bigger challenges we have had, fintech has taken a back step. And you can see even in my talk, although I have done work on fintech and published work on fintech, including fintech in Indonesia, I felt that it was not something that is top of the agenda at the moment, because it's really life and death type situation and recovery from this, where fintech has got nothing substantial to add. In terms of being of interest, because there is other bigger things. So yes, it's definitely obviously an important part of the financial system. How much policymakers are at the moment interested in that, in light of the fight that they have for policy innovation for recovery? I think very little. Very little, but it's important. This little. What I mean by that is, in the short term, the focus is on the bigger issues. But I think at some point, we would return to these other issues, including fintech, to see what is happening in that space. So that's my take, and I know I'll be interested to hear if somebody has got an alternative interpretation of that.
Okay,
how about
thank you.
The competition? How about the competition between fintech and conventional banking? Is there any increasing of competition after the pandemic?
Yeah, I think there is, if we just go by evidence in the financial news, there's hardly anything there that now talks about fintech and the banking sector. One of the reasons is because in many of the countries, you see, one of the good things from a banking sector point of view in this pandemic is that they have not been affected greatly. The banking sector activities have been very, very resilient, and unlike the financial crisis times, where the first sector that is affected is the banking sector. And a lot of the reasons for why the banking sector has been saved from the stress that we would normally associate banks with is because of the fiscal policy and the monetary policy responses to the pandemic. And the fiscal stimulus, for example, when people have been losing jobs, particularly in developed countries, where the big banks are, the fiscal stimulus to keep people in jobs, as well as giving them supplementary income in the developed countries, that ensured that people were able to pay off their mortgages, were able to still buy their goods, and make use of the services. So that's why one of the issues I raised in my talk is how sustainable these fiscal policies are, and what should be the policy response in developing countries. So at the moment, it seems to me that unless there is banking sector instability, will the role of fintech re-emerge as a substitute or as a solution, I think, to the problems of the banking sector. Aside from that, what we now see is that there is no information, at least that I'm aware of, that talks about fintech vis-a-vis banks in any negative way. So that competition, I think it's still conventional in terms of what they were doing. There are obviously certain things that the fintech can do better than conventional banking, right? So those services continue to be handled in the same way. But again, it's about having access to that data, and unless something happens in terms of instability in the financial system, we wouldn't know that. So yeah, so I think my knowledge is the same as yours in terms of not knowing much about what is happening with respect to fintech.
Thank you, Dr. Narayan. Thank you. It's interesting discussion with you.
Okay, thank you also, Pak Deddy Marciano, for the discussions time, and also Professor Narayan. We have so many questions in the chat box. I will I will read one by one. Now I will read the questions from Fajar. He is a UPM Malaysia alumni. He is asking about that pandemic COVID-19 in some of the country, including Indonesia, make country or also the government refocusing their budget to solve the pandemic with a huge amount. What do you think about this policy? And normally, how much portions of the budget should be relocated or refocusing to solve the pandemic problems? And also, do you have country that become a good role models in a good way to handling refinancing in budget for the pandemic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This is a very relevant question and a very relevant policy question in terms of what should be the fiscal stimulus and how much of the budget should a country spend. There's no straightforward answer to this, and it's not a simple issue to come up with some numbers. And there are multiple factors at play here, which kind of dictates what should be the fiscal policy response. One of the factors is obviously the financial capacity of the country that we are talking about. So there's no homogeneous policy rules here. It depends on your capacity. It depends on whether the country is a developed country or a developing country, least developed country. And we have seen this. We have seen the fiscal policy stimulus that have been implemented have been all driven by developed countries or high income emerging countries, where they have the fiscal discipline to be able to do that. The countries where all the debt to GDP is already high, as I mentioned in my talk, that there are many countries in this category who are either on the threshold of default or are in that kind of red zone, where more borrowings would really put a lot of pressure on the financial situation. So these are the countries, and there is a huge percentage of countries in this category who do not have that kind of borrowing space to be able to engage in the type of fiscal spending or fiscal policy related policies that we have seen in developed countries. So it's not a straightforward issue to provide an answer, because there's no rule books in here. It really depends on the capacity. It really depends on how much a country has been affected by the pandemic. And we have seen that countries like Australia and New Zealand, for instance, they have not been affected in terms of the number of deaths, the number of cases. They've been well controlled through government intervention policies, so to speak. So the countries who are in a different stage of controlling the pandemic would have a different a mindset on the type of policies that they would want to implement, and that includes not only fiscal policy but also the monetary policy responses as well. So this is maybe this is an area for future research, is to look at what is the optimal spending capacity of different countries, and what you end up finding is that countries who have already got a situation of high debt to GDP ratios would have very little space to be able to spend. So what are the alternatives for them? And this is what I meant in terms of future directions for research, is to look at first of all whether these countries, these developing countries, least developed countries, whether they have the fiscal discipline to be able to engage in any sort of fiscal stimulus at all. That's the first question. Is there capacity to engage in fiscal stimulus or not? Right? That's the first question. There may still be, but then the magnitude of that fiscal spending would not be at the same level as, say, developed countries. So what exactly is the capacity? And we don't know this. So this is a question that needs investigation, that needs robust investigation. Having found that, we can then start to entertain questions like, what are the alternatives? Because if a country cannot borrow simply because the debt to GDP ratio is unsustainable or is on the path of unsustainability, then the resulting questions are, what are the alternatives? And one of the alternatives that we would prescribe in a conventional climate, conventional means in a non-pandemic climate, would have been foreign aid and assistance, development assistance, right? That developing countries, least developed countries depend on official development assistance for their growth and development. That's the history. That solution and I'm not a development economist to have the authority to to talk in the details of it, but it's common sense that in light of the fact that developed countries and we're talking about Australia, New Zealand, UK, US, Japan, right? All this, think of this like the OECD countries. They have all been impacted by this pandemic. Their incomes have also fallen. People have also lost jobs in those countries. So these countries no longer have the capacity to be able to give official development assistance of the same scale and magnitude that used to happen pre-pandemic. So we have to understand that reality, that the solutions that we're going to come up, it cannot be what we have done in the past. No, we don't have the capacity to actually engage in those same sort of policies. That's why in my talk, I was talking about innovation. I talked about, I didn't say fiscal policy, I said fiscal policy innovation. And what I mean by fiscal policy innovation is, thinking about policies that we have not actually implemented in the past. And this is what I also mentioned, something like remittance, right? Remittances, many countries depend on remittances as foreign exchange. The question would be, can we, people who have moved from developing countries and are staying now, are citizens of developed countries, and can they continue to send money back to their home countries at the same rate? Again, the question is no. Why? Because many of those people themselves have lost jobs in this pandemic, or have undergone a decline in income. So their capacity, like their government's capacity to support people in developing countries or back home is not going to be as healthy as it was pre-pandemic. So there is a lot of thinking here, as you can see. We need to be very, very innovative in what we're going to propose, and that's why I suggested in my last point in the lecture that the quality of our work as academics should be judged by the type of impact we make to the recovery from the pandemic, and that requires innovative thinking. So these questions are all great, but I don't have answers to this. All I can, and I'm not an expert in everything that I have talked about here. I have particular expertise in the financial system side of things, financial market side of things, not necessarily on the development economic side of things. So these questions need to be looked at and continually, in a robust way. They need to be looked at. They need to be challenged, and that's what I felt the value of the talk should be today. So I'm glad that this type of questions I can see coming.
Okay, thank you for the answer. It's quite interesting, Professor Narayan. Okay, we still have plenty of times, but I think I cannot. I'm not sure I cannot read all of the questions because there are so many questions that we have in the chat box, but I will jump to the next questions. It's a question from Mr. Pei Jing Sung from National Central University to the Professor Narayan. What is your opinion about the future research path of the first path is in the bank sector's capital structure during the pandemic, and the second one is about the firm's capital structure subjected to the monetary policy during the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Yeah, I think again this is very important question, about capital structure, because the issue is that, like I mentioned in my talk, firms are going to be struggling to meet their financial obligations. There's a lot of reduction in economic activities, firm activities, production declines, productivity declines. What this is going to do, it is going to affect the credit ratings of firms. And when for any particular firm, there's two sources of financing. One is internal financing, so you're depending on your cash flow, your profits that you make. Cash flow, liquidity, they play a big part in this. A higher cash flow obviously signals that your internal financing is a stronger possibility. External financing is the second channel through which firms are able to invest. And external finance depends on credit ratings. You know, how cheaply you can access credit in the international markets depends on your credit ratings. And what this pandemic would do to the majority of the firms who are affected by that, particularly, you know, let's say in the service sector, in the tourism, hospitality industry, in the airline industry, you can imagine the slowdown of the economic activities in those industries, that the firm's credit ratings, their ability to borrow, is going to decline. So that's obviously going to affect the capital structure. And this is what is going to lead to closure of a number of firms who are not able to make that kind of adjustment to the capital structure in a financially stable way. And that's why I said in my talk that one of the possibilities, strong possibilities, is that the tourism industry is not going to return to what it was pre-pandemic. It may be another 10 years before something of that sort can happen in terms of recovery and a fully fledged tourism industry. I do not see, in my opinion, the industry returning to those pre-pandemic levels. So what it means that many of the businesses would have to close down. They don't have the financial space to be able to recover and restart. Okay? There will obviously be some of those industries firms who would be able to restart. But the question is how financially stable or viable these firms would be in a post-pandemic world. So the effectiveness of policy in the recovery of some of these sectors, like I said, higher education sector, our tourism sector, the service sector in general, the soundness and the effectiveness of policy in recovery, like I said, in my talk about labor market adjustments, how quickly some of these sectors can actually absorb the surplus labor that is there, right? What sort of incentives would be there for firms to be able to do that? How the state is going to empower these small businesses. By the way, talking about small businesses, one thing that comes to mind immediately is the SMEs. The SMEs are a big part of global economic activity. 60% of the global economic activity is driven by SMEs. A large proportion of jobs globally are due to the SMEs. The SMEs are the ones that are going to be most affected, because one of the key challenges for SMEs pre-pandemic was access to finance. Well, one of the things that has stopped SMEs from growing has been access to finance, and this is pre-pandemic we are talking about. What the pandemic has done, it has multiplied their problems of access to finance, and this is what is going to lead to a lot of disruptions in the SME sector as well. So when we talk about the business sector, I think it's important that we make reference particularly to the SMEs, because that's what is going to be impacted most. So as you can see, the news is not good. I mean, obviously, we are in unprecedented times, and that's the reality of it. How our research can help in this recovery is going to go a long way in mitigating a lot of these sort of negative implications that are predicted for global economies.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Narayan, for the answer. And also, because we also live on YouTube, our official YouTube channel of UNS Fintech Center. So it will be not fair if I'm not give the same opportunity for participant in YouTube channel who want to ask to Professor Narayan, as well as the participant in this room. So I will read the questions come from the participant in our YouTube channel. How do you think about the development of post-growth discourse during the pandemic? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I missed that question. Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Okay, okay. So Professor Narayan, this is questions come from the participant that join us in our official YouTube channel. The question is, how do you think about the development of post-growth discourse during the pandemic? Thank you.
So you said post-growth discourse.
Yes, post-growth discourse during the pandemic.
Okay. So one of the things that I talked about in my lecture was about the geopolitical tensions, and the trade wars that have affected the supply chains, and this has been a big part of food security in general, and also health infrastructure. These things would I think, in my opinion, would lead to more diversification. There would be, there have been too much dependence of one country on another, and we have not diversified enough. That's the reality of what we have learned as lessons from this. So one of the things I see happening more strategically now is, and I think this is the one of the ramifications of globalization, globalization without strategic thinking, and one of those strategic thinking that I'm sort of talking about here. Again, I'm not a sort of development economist or a political scientist to have the authority to speak at the same level as those experts would speak. But some of these things are common sense, and of course we can have different opinions on this. But I feel that there will be a strategic approach towards diversifying to ensure that the supply chains remain unaffected in any future pandemics, that countries are able to access raw materials for health infrastructure, for medications, and also in general for their exports. So I think that the lot of the political dialogue, conversations, tensions, whatever words you want to use to describe the status quo, is going to obviously lead to a change in strategic partnerships, in strategic thinking around diversification of our resource base, and being able to have a plan B in case of market failures. So I think, as I said, I'm not an expert in this area, but for what it is worth, and that's what I think is likely to happen.
Okay, thank you, Professor Narayan, for the answer. And now we will jump to the last questions from the participant. We are very sorry that because of the limitation of the time, so I cannot read all of the questions as well. So this is the last questions. I would like to read the first questions. Come from Pak Muhammad Nasir from FEB UHO. How about the roles of the central banks in order of the transformation and also the development of virtual money and also CBDC, and also as well as the same questions come from Bu Arin from UI. Is CBDC the key to unlocking the financial inclusion, and as well as the questions also about the cryptocurrency. Is it cryptocurrency is the promising topic to be for the future research in this area? From Bu Sulastri from UNS. Thank you, Professor Narayan.
Thank you. This is interesting that we are getting a wide variety of questions. The role of central banks. So, like I said in my talk, I think the role of central banks is really important in this pandemic. It has always been important in financial crises. We know that. We already knew that entering the pandemic. But like I said, just by monitoring the intensity of central bank activities by way of policy statements, by way of workshops and joint conferences and policy dialogues and the speeches that are given by governors and deputy governors or assistant governors, that's what I mean by the intensity of central bank activities. And if you look at that intensity, it tells a story. It tells a story of a world in which the central banks, for the first time in history, as far as I'm concerned, have become, I would say, overactive in trying to mitigate the risks that this pandemic poses. So the role of central bank, like I said in my talk, has not been investigated at all not to the extent that we would want to see or to understand, given the intensity of their activities. And as I said, there are central banks who are actively participating in a lot of these policy dialogues, including Bank Indonesia doing at least 4 things we're going to do this year with the Bank Indonesia, collaborating with the Asian Development Bank, and of course our 15th BMEB annual conference, where this pandemic issue is part of the call for papers. So I know the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, we are also doing work with them together with APEIA and Asian Development Bank Institute. Then in November, we are doing a central bank conference. So this is something I forgot to mention. In November 23rd, I think, 23rd to 26th, there's a big conference of central banks that is jointly going to be hosted by APEIA and ADB. At this stage, it looks like it's going to be an online conference, but it is going to bring together central banks from the Asia Pacific countries to discuss about this issue itself, which is what is the role of central bank, how effective has been the role of central banks, how sustainable has been the policy stance taken by the central bank. So all these important questions will be discussed there, and we are expecting to have panel discussions there as well. The panelists, including governors of different central banks and assistant governors and so forth. So you can see that the answer to this question is not there yet, because we don't know how effective the central banks have been and what should they be doing. So there's no convergence to the type of policies or monetary policies or central bank policy making that we can write down at the moment. No, if we were to write down a list of policies that central banks have implemented, we can list down without knowing how successful they have been. And I think this is the key issue here. In this forthcoming conference in November, we would have enough time to be able to judge the effectiveness of what central banks have been doing. And there's no right or wrong here, when it comes to central banking policies. The issue is, this is the first time we are confronted by this challenge, and what we are looking for is what has worked. And at the same time, identifying that, okay, these are A, B, C, D policies that have not worked. Right? So it is really identifying those clusters of policies, groups of policies, that have worked and those that have not worked, so that we can narrow down and converge to a policy blueprint that other central banks and other countries can use. So it's an open question, that role of central banks. The other thing about financial inclusion, I think again this was one of the key issues. Financial inclusion was a big topic in financial economics and financial policy making pre-pandemic, and financial inclusion helps develop and grow businesses, and SMEs are again a big part of that growth story. SMEs, like I said, they have already been facing the challenges of financial inclusion, financial inclusion in terms of gender, financial inclusion in terms of informal sector as well. So there have been a number of areas where financial inclusion had been important pre-pandemic. I'm talking about pre-pandemic. It's important to highlight that, because what has happened after after that, meaning from the onset of the pandemic, that the issue of financial inclusion has become an even bigger challenge. We had never come to terms with financial inclusion as a complete package in assisting the growth and development of our economies and the communities that we are part of. And what it is going to do is going to make financial inclusion even more challenging because of the things that we discussed in the lecture. One is that there is, once the banking sector is in stress, and in many of the developing countries, we have started to see traces of that happening, not so much in the developed countries, but you feel that if our international borders continue to be closed for longer periods of time, economic activities continue to be disrupted in the way that we have seen happening in the last 12 to 18 months, the banking sector is going to come under stress. There is likely to be banking sector instability. And once that happens, the issue of access to finance is going to be one of the core issues, and then I think the issue of financial inclusion is again something that we would need to rethink how we address that. So again, it is a pandemic that is unfolding. A lot of the financial implications of this from a banking sector point of view, from a financial system point of view, is still unfolding, and no, we don't necessarily have a prediction of how it is going to turn out, and therefore it is not something straightforward to address from a financial inclusion point of view. But what is clear is that there will be a lot of the sectors, including the informal sector, including our gender equality efforts under the MDGs, access to education, access to healthcare, access to proper health infrastructure. These are all going to be affected in the process. And again, these are all based on the assumption that we are not able to recover sooner then these are going to be issues. To the last point about cryptocurrencies, yeah, I mean, you're right. Cryptocurrencies have been a unique asset class for investments. It has made many millionaires, if not billionaires. It has continued to occupy the interest of researchers, and I think it will continue to attract that kind of attention. But the important thing is to look at it again from a central bank point of view, because many central banks, including Bank Indonesia, have discouraged citizens from trading in certain parts of the cryptocurrencies, like the bitcoins, for instance. There are other central banks who have, because of the greater volatility that it kind of creates, there has been that those kind of policy advisors. I'm not sure whether there has been strict policies prohibiting citizens from engaging in trading in cryptocurrencies in certain countries, but I think there are, because of the greater volatility threat that it brings. And we have seen recently with the big jump in Bitcoin prices and the decline or the sharp fall in the price of cryptocurrencies recently. So that's what the volatility aspect of it, and that's what can be distressing for the financial system if a lot of investments do happen. So there's obviously research agenda around that. Whether the pandemic has created to that, I don't know. I think again that's an area for future research. But yeah, cryptocurrencies or any asset class for that matter will continue to be of interest to financial economists and central banks and so forth. So yeah, I think all these are very, very relevant and very, very important questions, and questions that should form part of the research agenda going forward, more so if they can contribute to the policy debates and the policy thinking and assist central banks and of course fiscal policymakers in trying to devise policies that can help us recover from this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Narayan. Such a pleasant discussion time from you and also as well as for the participants. So thank you. So this is the end of this public lecture series, Recent Issues in Financial Economics, organized by Center for Fintech and Banking, Universitas 11 Maret. So of course, our big gratitude goes to Professor Taras Narayan, who able to attend this public lecture, and also Professor Narayan. Before we signing off from this room, please could you give us the closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I enjoyed as much as you did during this session. I think it's important that we do come together. Unfortunately, it has to be on Zoom and online, but that's the way it is, and that's the reality of where we are at this stage. We are, in a way, fortunate to be able to have this conversation. I was glad that many of you could join us on Zoom as well as on YouTube. That's always satisfying to know that people are interested in the work that I'm doing, and also it's a learning experience for me as well with the questions that were asked. So there's always learning happens two ways. It's not only I'm saying something and you are picking up my brains, but from the questions that many of you have asked, wonderful questions, which has allowed me to rethink and think. Thinking is an important part of growth. So I've also learned in answering those questions. I've also learned a few things. So I was happy to be here this afternoon, this evening, to talk to you and also share some of the research ideas, which I hope that you would find value in and would be able to refine it and reset your research agenda. I think that one of the things I would want to say is that going forward in both policy and academic research, the story of pandemics cannot be excluded because it has had a big impact on us globally. Whether it's from the day-to-day lifestyles to the work we do, it has impacted us. And it will continue to be with us, and we should be prepared for future pandemics as well. So if our research can be sort of tailored to looking at those real world issues that can help make a difference to the life of others, then we should continue, or I would encourage you to continue reshaping your research in that direction without making structural changes, obviously. And lastly, to say is, for all of you to participate in the various activities that APAIA is hosting, particularly with Bank Indonesia, and most of you being from Indonesia would be interested in that. So we have at least 3-4 activities with Bank Indonesia, with the BMEB Journal of Bank Indonesia, and I hope that all of you would be able to, at some point in the future, be able to submit your papers to the journal. As I said, the journal has graduated to a Q2 journal, which is a very significant achievement for us, given that we became Scopus less than 2 years ago. So, your participation as Indonesian researchers, and of course, everyone else joining us from Malaysia and India and other parts of the world on YouTube and other places, the journal is global. We welcome all authors to submit their papers. And for me, it's a pleasure to be the managing editor of Central Bank of Indonesia's journal. We have a wonderful team of editors and support staff that do wonderful work for the journal to make it world-renowned. And we look forward to your contributions to the journal as Indonesians and non-Indonesians who are joining us from other parts of the world. So I wish you all the best for your research, and stay safe until we can meet and see each other. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Also, of course, we hope after all of this pandemic ends and also the recovery, we are able to invite you to come to Solo. Yeah, Professor Narayan.
Yeah,
we can wait from that for that time. Yeah, to welcome you.
Thank you very much. From Solo, I'll go to Bali.
Okay. Okay, great. So once again, thank you for this great sharing sessions. Before we really end these sessions, the committee asked me to have a virtual photo session. So please, everyone, could you turn on your camera, and we will have a virtual photo sessions. I will count 1, 2, 3. So please be ready. Okay, thank you. So, committee? Okay. Okay, I will count 1, 2, and 3. Again, once again. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, thank you so much. So thank you as well for all of the participants that has joined us in this room and also in the YouTube official YouTube channel of Universitas of Center for Fintech and Banking Universitas 11 Maret for make this course possible. Please be safe everyone wherever you are. I am Agista Prameswari signing off from this room. See you on the next event. Thank you.
Thank you.